And this is Chad Hester and How Do I IA? So take it away.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody at the Nerd Summit for presenting, participating, listening, and sponsoring this. So this is a presentation about information architecture. This is not a presentation to tell you every possible thing that you need to know, because that's not the sort of subject for a presentation. Instead, this is rather to dispel some myths and also get you up and running to make improvements to an existing information architecture or come up with something brand new. So this is about effective design and improving user experience. I'm Chad Hester. I'm an enterprise technical consultant and solutions architect. I've been developing for the web for over 20 years, working very specifically with Drupal for the past 12 years. I've also been an information architect and UX strategist for over a decade. I'm a strong advocate for open source software and also the user experience community, encouraging participation and learning. So a little housekeeping. A lot of times we get acronyms in the technology world, like many other sort of worlds, and this can be a little bit confusing. So before we get any deeper, I want to make sure that everybody here understands what these acronyms are. So IA is information architecture, UX is user experience, UI is user interface, not to be mistaken for user experience. KPI is a key performance indicator, and PMF, which is probably the least familiar, is performance measurement framework. I actually have a dedicated presentation on that separate from this. So if anybody has any questions specific to that, I'd be happy to answer by, well, sending you there. But without further ado, is this a presentation for you? And in this presentation, we hope to answer a few different questions. And that is, what is information architecture? How does information architecture impact user experience and design? And how do you create an effective user information architecture or improve existing information architecture? So since this is a quick presentation, this is not meant to be comprehensive nor reductive of the effort involved. Great information architecture is detected, not invented. So if this is less familiar, maybe work with people who have worked in this, or at least practice and get your hands dirty. Know that you're going to make mistakes along the way, and that's okay. It's about what's good enough, not about perfection. If you want to see the slides that we're looking at now, here's a bit.ly link, and we'll keep going. This link will also be on the last slide, so that way if you miss it, you'll see it there. So our first question, what is information architecture? And this has actually come up a few times in my career where sometimes people think, oh, it's just the content types, especially if you're in the Drupal world. That's a very tempting thing to think, or it's just the navigation. We need to make that better, right? Well, it's more than that. It's a lot of things. And let's start with a definition directly from the book, Information Architecture for the Web and Beyond. And that is, it is a design discipline that is focused on making information findable and understandable. Now that's a broad definition, and that's a good thing. We want that to be kind of our beacon to see, can we test this? Is my information findable? Do people understand it? If it passes that test for your target audience, you're probably heading in the right direction. And if it doesn't, then you clearly have some work to do. And it's not about my opinion about the things that I build. It's about my audience's ability to find and understand things. So why information architecture? Well, it's a major component of user experience design. And user research and testing with rapid prototypes really does help improve success. We can all make our assumptions, but those assumptions can actually lead us down paths that, well, can be erroneous. And you fail late, it gets more expensive. So try to fail early, and you do that through testing. You also want to empathize with your audience, so good user research helps as well. Now, good information architecture accommodates changing needs and decreases technical debt inherited by old systems. So what I mean by that is, if you are integrating with an existing system and you can't change that system, well, you can still mutate that through the integration to fit your needs. In addition to that, it's not just about what you need today or what you have today. You want to consider how things might scale and grow. And if you have that sort of foresight, you can build things that are a bit more flexible. More importantly, modern design improves performance and credibility. If you are giving people information that they expect and in a way that they understand, they will begin to trust you more. And it also improves performance in the sense that it's showing people what they need when they need it, not everything, hoping for the best, throw something against the wall and hope it sticks. You're being a little bit more intentional and you're listening to your audience to do that. And there are thoughtful information architecture parts that may be hidden from view, but yet support user needs. So for example, you may have a taxonomy that nobody actually ever sees, but it's part of a search index to help the findability of things. So let's take a pause here. We said early on, what is information architecture? And there's, again, some myths about what it might be, or it might be a very myopic view. Here's what the information architecture book and many other resources point out as being the 5 main points of information architecture. That is content structure, taxonomy, labeling, navigation, and search. These all work very elegantly together. And the way that we define this is content structure. So for example, an event page, it's different information points. You might have dates and times, you might have a location, you might have a list of speakers. That's structured data. And a lot of times in computer science, we're aware of structured data or objects, but from the end user perspective, we're not really thinking of those things. To be effective when constructing a system that stores information, we can be very thoughtful about how those parts are used and then structure data in a way to mutate them depending on different contexts. So just to really wrap this in, content structure is things like fields and other structures to build out unique objects. Oftentimes taxonomy and other things like that. Taxonomy itself is a way of classifying and grouping information for better context and retrieval. So the word is very similar to other scientific terms, as you can see here, but really just think of how you categorize things. And there are 2 different ways of thinking of that. There's free tagging, which we're most familiar with, the hashtag that you see in Twitter, or there's controlled vocabularies. So like the states of the United States, which is not going to change without an act of Congress or an act of war. So those controlled vocabularies, maybe it's a list of predefined colors that are on brand and accessible that you want a content manager to pick from. Maybe it's a list of very specific departments within your organization. That's something that you don't want content managers to necessarily fiddle with because it destroys consistency. Labeling systems, the words mean something. And this isn't that in-speak, that vernacular that you use with your back office peers. This is the vocabulary that makes sense to your audience. And that might require a bit of research to understand what it is. And it's not about perfect, it's about effective. What words connect? I would even go so far as to say that those words, the less technical and scientific they are, where possible, they reach a broader audience and they also translate a little bit better. Navigation strategy, that's the big one. That's the one that's right in everybody's face. How do you navigate whatever website you are putting together? Search strategy, very similar. If I want oven mitts and I go to Amazon, I'm not going to navigate through the menu system to try to find oven mitts. I'm going to type in oven mitts in the search. Well, how do I filter down the results to what it is that I want? Maybe there's a trusted brand. Maybe there's a price point. That's all a part of a search strategy, but they're different things and they all work together. So our next major question, how does information architecture impact user experience and design? Well, let's consider the most common complaint that we will typically hear from website users. I can't find what I'm looking for. That in of itself is the strongest indicator of an information architecture problem, because if you remember our earlier quote, it's about the findability and understandability of information. So clearly something's not findable, or if they did find it, maybe they just didn't understand it. So that's something that we want to challenge ourselves to explore and remove our preconceived notions and just go through the process of figuring out how do we solve this problem. Now, for a little bit more context, again, information architecture is but a part of many, many parts that give an end user their experience. There are a lot of hidden parts alongside of it, like content strategy. The end user isn't aware of what you did with your content strategy. It's just something that makes their experience better. They'll typically experience, tip of the iceberg, copywriting, graphics design, user interface, and interaction design. That's something very much in their face, but there's a lot of stuff underneath the surface there to bring that experience to them. Information architecture is also a part of a much bigger picture when it comes to user experience design. So this is a nice graphic that I came across a few years ago, and there's a link at the bottom of this that kind of captures where it fits in the thick of all of these things. Now, you'll notice that there's a lot in here, and this goes beyond just website design. Information architecture is a part of, if I wanted to build a library, have thoughtful signage about, well, here's where the help desk is versus where the bathroom is. How do I navigate the library? Well, information architecture is most certainly a part of that sort of thing. And as you can see here, we also have a few other things that might be familiar terms to you as well. So for example, architecture itself, that is, spatial design. Digital signage pops in there. You also have things like interaction design. User interface design is right there in the middle. Communication design, which gets a little bit broader. And all of these things are just one big mess of a Venn diagram, overlapping inside. Point I'm making is this, is that you can't have good user experience without good information architecture. It's a thoughtful experience. So that brings us to this next question. Who is primarily responsible for information architecture? We'll get to that in 2 slides. So right into this question, our main question, how do you create or improve information architecture? When I say you, I might be referring to you, the listener, but I might also be referring to you, the broad audience, because, well, it's a team effort. There are a lot of people involved in understanding what can be done. The first and foremost is support users, those people that represent your audience. If you're going to build a new car, if you're going to build a spaceship, if you're going to build a building, there are people typically involved utilizing those things. And you want them to be represented in what it is that you're designing. You want to test with them. So support users as early as possible, you want to identify, because they are contributors to that. Am I building this exclusively for me? Then, hey, I guess I'm that support user, but chances are what you're working on isn't necessarily for you. You also have stakeholders. So if you're an agency working with a client, or if you are working for the company that's producing this thing, who is it that is a stakeholder in the success of what it is that you're producing? Talk to them, consult them. Subject matter experts. Somebody knows a lot about what it is that you're doing, and probably more than one person. If there is an actual dedicated information architect, of course, that's somebody that's going to be very important to championing good IA design. User experience designers are also typically seasoned in information architecture, user interface designers, developers, strategists. There's all these overlaps of what these roles are, and some of these roles might be the same person. So this is, again, not meant to be comprehensive, but this tries to answer that question: who is contributing to this? But who's primarily responsible? The question that we asked 2 slides back. Well, that depends on the makeup of your team. If you have a designated information architect on your team, well, that's probably pretty obvious. I've held several different positions at different companies where I've been a developer, I've been a solutions architect, I've been a user experience strategist, I've been a business analyst, I've been a director of technical support. There have been different things that I've done in my career, and along the way, I picked up information architecture, and well, frankly, I haven't let it go. So ask yourself the question, what is your role? How is it that you're contributing? Is there somebody else in my company that is more responsible? Point being is that somebody needs to take ownership of it. And whether that's a designer or a designated role, that's really important to figure out early. So we talked about the 5 points of information architecture. Well, there's something that kind of leads into defining that. So once you know what your content types are, your taxonomy, your navigation system, labeling, search strategy, you kind of got there somehow. Well, this is an answer to how do we get there? I'm a big proponent of asking questions. Even if I make an assumption, I'm going to turn it into a question. Try to remove some bias and try to figure out, okay, what are we trying to really do to be successful here? And that brings us to the 3 points of IA and user experience research. So the who, the why, and the what. The who is the users, the why is the context, and the what is the content. And a lot of times when we do research in this field, those are the 3 kind of areas that we're trying to focus and develop an understanding. So if you don't know who you're building this for, well, I can tell you that's really the first thing that you need to figure out. The why, well, developing some context, and then the content itself you may already have, or you may need to invest in developing that collateral. So there's a lot of overlap between user experience research, business analysis, and also content strategy. So to dig into these 3 things, again, we want to really champion these questions. Who is your audience? What are their needs, their desires, their motivations, likes, dislikes, frustration? For context, so why are you building or improving that system? What's the purpose? What's the value proposition? And what are the business needs, the constraints, the assumptions, testable outcomes, measurements of that? Content, well, what information is currently available? How can it be presented to support user needs? How is it managed? I don't want to see somebody build a system that's unmanageable because nobody has the time or the education to be able to manage it. So you have to take that into account. And can that content be reshaped to better suit needs, whether they're user needs or business needs? So it's those are questions that you really want to start off with. So it's that transition from doing some good research, that exploration, and then coming into definition of those 5 points of IA, just at least being aware of what the answers are to those sort of things. So to put this into action, again, identify valuable questions, conduct research to try to answer those questions, create diagrams and design artifacts, because orally describing something to people is not nearly as effective as seeing something where possible. So diagramming is a very powerful tool in your arsenal. And if you're not very used to that, start practicing. It's a great way of communicating even beyond just IA. Facilitate the team and the user's needs, or sorry, user exercises. It's really important to understand that when you're pulling in users to do different things, why you're going to do those exercises, usually for exploration or to try to help define something. So things like card sorting exercises or tree testing, or just in general, user testing as a whole. And document your progress as a team. Just because you spend time doing this stuff, is it going to make its way all the way to the development team and inform what it is that they're going to do? And if not, why are you doing it? So you want to make sure that you're doing this as a team, so that way there's a shared understanding. There's no single point of authority. It's a shared exercise. And then build something. Build as early as you possibly can, because these are theories until you prove them. You may also want to consider using what I refer to as a PMF. It's a performance measurement framework to monitor the performance of key performance indicators. A lot of times I see this as the hammer looking for the nail problem. I need to build a website. Why do you need to build a website? Because people need information. Why do they need information? Well, they need information because I don't know. In some cases you do know, and that's great. But what I would also argue is that every single thing that you produce for money, especially, or that has some sort of agenda, should have some sort of definition of success. Once you define success, you can translate that into key performance indicators. We're not talking about page views or bounce rates. We're talking about, is your e-commerce site making more money? Is it increasing the quantity of sales? I mean, the very obvious things that just stand there screaming in your face, this is what success looks like. Am I getting enough people attracted into my e-commerce site? And that's just an example of an e-commerce site. And then you want to test, learn, and repeat those things. So in the research side of things, there are a number of questions that we can ask to try to dig into defining and understanding users. So do you know who they are, what they want? Well, there's some exercises you can do: cohort analysis, user surveys, user interviews. Do you understand if your website's effective? Maybe you have an existing one. Well, you can take a look at the data, you can prototype new ideas, and you can do user testing. And you see the theme here. You ask a question, and there are different exercises that try to move you along in answering those sort of questions. And this is just exploration in the research side of things. You'll also notice that in some cases, there's overlap between different questions and different exercises that can answer those questions. So where possible, if you have multiple questions and you have one exercise that can answer multiple questions, that's a high value exercise. There's a lot that you can get out of it. So try to promote those sort of things. And you'll see this repeating. So when we're exploring context, why should we build or improve this? So talk to stakeholders, subject matter experts, and the users themselves. How do we know if we're succeeding? Remember what we just said: monitor KPIs, also do user testing, do data analysis. So again, you'll see this common theme: ask questions, and here are just a handful of questions to help explore context. There are some exercises that help here too. And then lastly, content. There's a great book called Content Strategy for the Web, and it's by an author, Christina Halverson. She does a fantastic job of making it very easy to read. It's not that hard a book to read. If you're a fast reader, probably clear it in a weekend. But again, you have to understand that if you're going to invest in creating content, that becomes collateral for your organization. That's time that's gone into that. So try to figure out how to audit that content if it already exists and give it a value. The less that you have, the easier it is to manage. So at some point, we have to start transitioning over from, okay, we've developed an understanding, and now we need to start defining our IA. And that's okay. You can start with a simple model and just grow from there. But the point is just understanding what the failure points are and how it is that you could scale as well. You want to try to evaluate things in terms of the build, measure, learn loop. That is, what are you going to build now? How can you measure it? What did you learn from it? And then what can you build next? And that's the lean startup sort of philosophy. So to define content structure, you're going to see this theme. We ask questions, and then we create different artifacts to try to define those things. So diagrams, really, really helpful in defining content structure. Content strategy itself, just defining, okay, here's what our content is, so therefore we need to support it with this structure. Priority guides are really good too. They're kind of like wireframes, but think just strictly a mobile layout, and it forces you to say, this is more important than the next thing, more important than the next thing, etc. So look at priority guides if you're not familiar with that. There's a good article on Smashing Magazine about that from 2012. Wireframes, of course, design mockups, prototypes. And also IA specification spreadsheet. That is a spreadsheet that defines here all the fields and the different data objects I have. Taxonomy, again, the categorization of things. So diagrams can help just show the relationships between things. Card sorting exercises are absolutely excellent. If you don't know how you want to organize things in maybe a hierarchy, then an open card sorting exercise may help. Or if you're still trying to define things, but you know how you want to put things in buckets, maybe a closed card sorting exercise. Taking inventory of taxonomy terms is also very important, and so forth. But again, just figure out what sort of questions you want to ask to help drive defining these things. Labeling systems. This is very often neglected, but again, words matter. So we want to recognize what users' mental models suggest things should be labeled as, and what you call something may differ from what somebody else calls something. What we want to do is try to figure out what common terminology people have. And you may be talking about people across multiple disciplines, and that's a challenging thing, but neglecting this can really harm the usability of a website, and it makes things harder to find and most certainly harder to understand. So there are different exercises for that. Tree testing, taxonomy inventory. We'll see some similarities with the last one. And of course, prototyping is really important too. Is it actually testing well? Some other questions for navigation. Again, what are people trying to find? How are they interacting with the navigation? What sort of system do they have? Is it mostly mobile, mostly desktop? And just being sensitive and empathetic to that. How can things be grouped? What's the sequence of things? One thing that I'll also emphasize, if you have an international audience, left to right versus right to left languages really, really make a big impact here. So typically for left to right reading, you want the most important item starting from the left and then going on to the right. And the reason being is that's how we naturally read. So that's how we're going to encounter things. You want the most important thing to come first. So if I click on that, then I'll find most likely what I'm looking for, and then it tapers off from there. And you want to group things by, let's just call them task groups typically. But we're not trying to force our website or application to exist in a hierarchy. It's more just a matter of that's how the navigation works. In fact, you can probably think of your content just more as a flat list. How people get to your content is a matter of what you put in your navigation, but also hyperlinking. One oft forgotten thing about navigation is contextual links. If I'm reading an article, I can put a link right in the middle of the article that says, here's more information. There's nothing wrong with that. I could, be looking at a product and see a list of related products. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's a contextual link. So there's more to navigation than just a menu system, and be aware of that. So none of this is a substitute for doing more research in information architecture. This is more of just a light touch, trying to give you a sense of the sort of things that we're attempting to define together. Bunch of artifacts in here to help with navigation. The most popular in navigation strategy is going to be a sitemap diagram, of course, but other things facilitate navigation beyond just that sitemap. So wireframing can be very helpful, and even taking a look at the content as it exists on your website to figure out, can I go do this? And that's where things like user testing really happens. So give somebody a task, watch what they do, see if they can find it. And if they find it through effective navigation, great, it's working. And if not, then, well, you know that there's a change that you need to make. And one of the last, again, points that we need to define is search strategy. So how is it that people are finding things using your search? Are there search filters that help them drill down, or facets? Filters and facets aren't the same thing. They're very similar in operation though. Can results be sorted? And this is something that a lot of times I'll see on websites, people will put like sort by, and then what are your choices? Well, that depends on the content. Am I going to alphabetically sort all of the pages in my website? It does not necessarily make sense, but it does make sense when we're talking about a list of people where I might know their name and I can scan through it. Am I going to sort all of my contacts by date? Well, no, that makes sense for articles and events for sure. So we want to be really thoughtful when it comes to these sort of things. Is this something that helps? Less is more. It's easier to add than it is to subtract. So start simple. Start with the things that you absolutely need and test that. If you need to add more, great. But the more you add, the more distractions you'll actually give people, and that might not necessarily be good. So a couple different things that you can test with search strategy. Again, the best is building something, but before you get there, again, diagrams and wireframes are probably my favorite to tease out search strategy, because you can actually contextualize what it is that you're seeing. And there are valid things for either global search or a very specific sort of search page. Maybe it's, I just have a staff directory. Okay, what department are they in? Maybe that's a filter. Does that make sense on a global search? Probably not as much. Am I searching events by that same thing? Probably not. So ask questions and go through exercises to try to define those things. So you're probably noticing a trend. You want to plan both your research and how you're going to start defining things. And you want to also prioritize what you need to understand the most. So if I'm building a website and I know that the event calendar is the biggest reason that that website exists, well, I'm going to focus very heavily on events. And maybe staff bio pages are the least important thing on that website in a given scenario. And if that's the case, I'm dropping it down to the bottom of the list. It doesn't mean that I won't talk about it. It just means that I'm not going to lead with those sort of questions. You want to try to find other sort of questions that you can ask, of course, but uh, testing can't say it enough. You want to also understand potential failure points. If you know that ahead of time, you can also prepare to fail early. So I'll wrap things up by saying continuous improvements are by far and large one of the things that I love talking about the most. I have in my early childhood learning disabilities. School is very tough for me. So for me, continuous improvements are something that's a real drive motivator. And I put together an article that you can read. It's called Educate Responsibly. And that is understanding where you are in the process of education of any topic. So, at one point, I didn't know what a Tesla car was. And then maybe I saw one driving on the road, maybe I didn't understand it. Then maybe I read about it and then I'm acquainted. Maybe I actually studied it by going and test driving one. Maybe I bought one. Now I'm experienced. And then maybe I mastered Tesla cars by taking it out on the racetrack and driving faster than everybody else. Well, that's any topic that it is that you might want to learn, including information architecture. So with that in mind, one of the strongest suggestions that I can make to learn any subject is find a mentor. Find somebody that already practices in this space. I'm happy to mentor anybody that's interested. I appreciate everybody attending this presentation to hear me talk about it, but I learned from other people as well. And attend social events just like this. Participate. But I can't emphasize this enough. At a certain point, you move from studying this stuff to needing to do it. And by doing it, you're going to make mistakes along the way, and that's fine. We all make mistakes, and that helps you learn. But be prepared for that and produce something good and effective. It's not about perfect. It's about just getting your hands dirty and doing the stuff and trying to make the world better, if not just through a website. Sometimes tools, we get hung up on tools like what diagramming tool are we using, things like that. But if you're not familiar with one, try a few out, figure out which ones are effective for communicating with other people, collaborating, and just getting your idea out. And then repeat, don't stop. But don't change for change's sake. Do it because you're actually trying to improve yourself or other things. So some recommended resources. The first and foremost, it reads like a textbook, and that is the Information Architecture for the Web and Beyond book. It's really long. It took me months to get through it, but I was taking bite-sized pieces. It's intelligent. It's very easy to understand what they're saying. It's just a lot of information. A much easier book to read, and this is kind of a weekend book, is How to Make Sense of Any Mess. A fantastic book. The takeaway from that is, again, asking questions, doing diagrams, and really trying to figure out how you're moving forward through that process. Another book that's fantastic is Content Strategy for the Web. It does touch a lot on information architecture topics because of the heavy overlap between content strategy and IA. And then there are these three websites that I couldn't recommend enough. This is just a hungry place for information in this area. So yeah, that's my presentation. I'll see if anybody has any questions or wants to go over anything in particular about deliverables or techniques.
So I think you said you didn't really get started in IA and UX and all this stuff, right? You kind of found your way into it. What kind of led you down that path? And I've seen you present now 2, 3 times, and you're always very consistent about kind of, your perspective and your passion for this. And you've clearly found your calling, but kind of how did you find your way there?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Good question. Well, I think having started as a backend developer, I was actually studying originally to be a mechanical engineer. So that's just how my brain kind of works. I tinker with things. And I'll be honest, tinkering with software is so much easier because I could do it anywhere without any tools other than a computer. So that's kind of what got me into constructing things. But it mutated a little bit as I tend to be a rather empathetic person. When I build things, I'm aware that I'm not building it just for my own pleasure. I'm building it for other people, and I want to see them succeed. So as I encountered user experience early in my career, I recognized information architecture as a language to start defining the fundamental constructs of building systems that help convey, well, information. That, and I had a really good mentor.
Looks like Ray has a question. Can you briefly explain what tree testing is? How does one perform tree testing for Drupal sites?
Oh, sure, sure. So there are a few different online tools that you can use to help you with tree testing because there's a lot of data typically in that. I think that's Optimized Workshop. There are a few different tools like that. The point of tree testing is to say, okay, I have a navigation system and I put different links inside of my navigation system to try to allow you to browse this website. And I'm not going to tell you where things are, but I'm going to give you a task. Maybe I'm sending you to a university website and I'm going to give you the task of browsing the course catalog. It's up to you to see how you do that. So a tree test will actually monitor a person using that website to figure out how it is that they actually get down to that sort of area to see how effective that navigation is. So it's that's really what its main purpose is to validate whether or not your navigation is successful. And over, typical scientific sort of study, over enough people, you gather enough evidence as to whether or not there's a predisposition of people finding what you want them to find versus not. And then you can make minor changes. And if you make a minor change, you'll need to run the test again to see whether or not that's more effective. Any other questions?
Great. Anybody else have any questions? I'm going to answer Megan's question. She had asked about Unplugged Day. I mentioned it before the talk. Unplugged is when you don't, it's no work, it's no tech, it's no emails, it's no meetings, just do nothing related to work. So it's been kind of nice today to just focus on the summit.
Yeah, and my company calls it a recharge day, which means you're not supposed to be doing work, but it's not quite as I don't know, aggressive, so to speak, as unplugged. Unplugged probably is actually better because when you're recharging, you're really recharged better if you're also unplugged, right? Like, but anyway, it's a great practice.
Jess has a question. Do you find certain design artifacts to be more helpful for getting buy-in or working with a team?
Yeah, actually, that's a fantastic question. The shortest possible answer is always going to be it depends. And the reason I say that is, well, not all websites are the same, not all apps are the same, not all things that you're building, because information architecture goes beyond just the website development. But there are some things that I'll very commonly return to for websites that I build. I build a lot for nonprofits, higher education. I've done lots in e-commerce, but there's some very common trends that I'll see. Sitemap diagram, of course. What's the big picture? They refer to that as a top-down artifact, bird's eye view. You're just seeing broadly, not deeply. And then I like going the exact opposite direction. So typically I'll do what's called a page flow diagram. There's these little stencils of little pages that you move between one step to the next. And what I'll typically do, that's a bottom up artifact. I'll talk to lots of stakeholders, lots of users to figure out, okay, what are people trying to do on this website? And I'll distill that list to about maybe half a dozen to a dozen things, the core things that people want to do on this website, what I refer to as critical paths. And then I'll say, okay, well, what does that look like? How do they get there? What pages do they encounter along the way? And sometimes they'll branch off a little bit. But a page flow diagram really helps answer the question, how do I get there from here? So if I'm applying for a student loan, well, where do I start? And what pages occur across the way? And what that does is it actually helps hold the website managers responsible for making sure that the pages along that path clearly indicate how to get from each step and give them enough information to make good decisions along the way. So those are really good pages to, if you have a website with hundreds of thousands of pages, well, these are the pages that you have to get absolutely right. All the other pages kind of fall off the like leaves on a tree. These are the main branches. So that really helps. There are a couple other diagrams or design artifacts that'll create. Wireframes are, of course, really good. The biggest thing that I can say about wireframing is you can't think of a wireframe existing page by page by itself. Think of it more like a storyboard. You're telling somebody a story. And when you present wireframes to stakeholders to get buy-in, just like anything else, you're always telling them a story. Here's the purpose of this. Show them your math. Show them the logic behind what decisions you were making. And by showing somebody wireframes as an example, you're walking them right through it. And there are actually some good tools that will help you take your wireframes and stitch them together so they're actually clickable. So somebody can go offline, click through a few things. You can show them, hey, this is not a real thing. It's just on the rails. It's fake. But go ahead and click through it. Get a feel for it. Project yourself as if this were built. Does this allow us to accomplish the task? So the word, is it effective? That's the word I really want to hang on. Perfect is not nearly as helpful.
Megan has a question.
Mhm.
How much energy should be spent on database architecture when thinking about your UX challenges that stem from information architecture?
Yeah. So I mostly work with Drupal, which abstracts its database, but still has some of those same like fundamental database kind of mentalities of structuring content types, taxonomies, things of that nature. But I've also worked on raw database sort of systems before as well. Uh, a lot. Maybe that's the backend developer and sysadmin and me talking, but I feel like the front end, the for lack of a better phrase, lipstick on a pig, is actually much easier to change than the underlying architecture. So getting that underlying architecture right allows you to scale and accommodate changing needs. So if I have, for example, I like returning to an event content type because it's something we can all relate to, and we're at an event right now. An event has a name, it has a date and sometimes a time, it has a location, in this case, virtual, but here we are, we're all here. And a lot of times it will also have schedules, speakers. We start to define that structure, and that structure can increase in size over time. One thing that I'll typically reference when constructing content types is something like schema.org. If you can think of a content type, somebody has probably thought of it before you. So go take a look at an existing reference and see if you can pull from that helpful morsels. You're not trying to create a content type or a data structure with hundreds of possible fields. You're thinking of your use case and what do you need, not possibly need, not what ifs. Don't fall down the what if rabbit hole, but think about what you need today and how that might change within the next year or two, and be aware that that's okay. You could be wrong about some of those things. And the more likely you are wrong, the more you should probably just not do it.
And it looks like we have time for one more question.
Okay.
From Ray. Any particular wireframing or flow diagram tools that you recommend?
Oh, yeah. The best answer that I can give you is the one that you're most familiar with. But there's a ton. In fact, it's an ever-growing thing. And I would recommend not changing tools just for the sake of tools' sake. It's fun to play with things. I'm quite partial to Figma. I also like Sketch, but things like pencil and paper. If you haven't done sketching on pencil and paper, it is so much faster. A whiteboard also really helps. And those are rapid tools. You know, sometimes people get lost in digital tools because they'll fiddle around with settings. I'm very type A. So for me, like everything has to be perfect. And then I start to lose what was I doing in the first place. So find what works really well for you and also what helps share and collaborate with other people. There are other tools that kind of complement that, like InVision. So that way you can have collaborative commenting on those sort of things. And last thing about wireframing and diagramming tools is annotations. Like sometimes you just need to say what a thing is, but like kind of off out of the distraction of the main viewport. So that's really helpful to carry the conversation. For diagramming, typically I'll use Lucidchart because I like a cross-platform tool. I do pay for it. I used to use Visio quite a bit. I know there are a lot of free tools, but honestly, whatever works for you and gets your information out, it's the good enough principle that I would emphasize. So yeah, thank you all very much
Oh,
for
great.
the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Chad.
Great work, Chad. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.